I've seen a lot of discussion recently about games ownership and preservation. This is something I've thought about for a long time because I care about actually owning my games. A lot of the time when people discuss this topic, they tend to talk about only how we don't own our games, we can't own our games, and they leave out the options that we have to own our games. So I decided to throw together this tier list of the different options available for buying games and see how they stack up in terms of ownership and preservation. It's a bit different from a standard tier list in that it's split into two because every option for buying games basically breaks down into you either own the game or you don't, which will become clear as I go through them. The top tier for ownership is physical ownership. You have a physical product, it's yours, you can keep it, you have all your consumer rights intact. It's the gold standard for owning games. The question these days is, to what degree do you actually own the games that you physically own? Because consoles connect to the internet, games get updated, games can require the internet, games cannot work without patches, etc., etc. Do you actually own your physical games? The first thing we have to look at to address this is the platforms themselves. Do the platforms themselves actually work offline? Do they work without an account, without an internet connection, whatever? And I've chosen the PS5 and the Switch specifically to represent physical ownership because these two platforms definitely do. Both these consoles never have to be connected to the internet to work. You can buy them, take them out of the box, never put them on any kind of network, and they'll happily play games. They may require firmware updates in order to play newer games, but in both of these consoles, the firmware updates come with the games. So you never have to worry about that. It'll update off the disc or off the cartridge, and you just play your game. I've tested this personally with my PS5 and my PS4 and my PS3, incidentally. I don't have any footage of it, unfortunately, but I've seen it do it. There is a video online of this being tested on a Switch, however, taking an out-of-the-box Switch and testing it with a variety of games to see if it can play them successfully offline. I'll link that in the description. What about Xbox and PC? I couldn't find that much information about Xbox, but I did see that even to set up the console initially, you need an internet connection, which isn't a good start. And of course, Microsoft were the ones who last generation pushed associating your physical games with a digital account so that you can't resell them or lend them or whatever, which lost them that generation to some degree. So we won't worry too much about Xbox. And on PC, of course, physical distribution is a total lost cause. It essentially doesn't exist anymore. The real question is the games themselves. You'll hear from people on the internet that games these days all require an internet connection to function, or that they require a day one patch or they're unplayable, or even in some cases that there is no game on the disc, it's just a license to download the game. Is any of this actually true? Fortunately, there's a useful resource online, doesitplay.org, which tests games and tracks whether or not they work offline, how well they work offline, and gives you some statistics on it as well, so you can see how the platforms are doing. So using this, you can make sure that you only buy games that actually do work offline. And it turns out the majority of them, based on the testing done by Does It Play, the majority of games on both PS5 and Switch actually do work completely offline. The Switch has a bit of an advantage. The PS5 is pretty much the worst one so far. It was okay back in the PS3 days. PS4 was much worse. PS5 is worse. Switch isn't amazing. I mean, ideally the number should be 100%. All of your games should work if you buy them on disc. But it is what it is. The Switch is the best option, PS5 is next best option, and as long as you avoid the garbage games made by garbage developers that don't work properly, yes, you can still own your games as if you're using a PS2. Some people argue that you don't own your physical games, they're licensed to you instead. Of course, in practical terms, your games are yours. What's anyone going to do about it? What are they going to do, break into your house and take your games? And I'm not sure that a video game EULA specifically has ever actually been upheld. I couldn't find such a case when I searched for it. But it's an interesting question. Do you legally own your physical games? What people usually bring up here is the case of Werner versus Autodesk, which was about the right to resell the software. In this case, the ruling did say that the guy doesn't own the software. It's licensed instead. But what the ruling was referring to was legal ownership, and legal ownership confers the right to resell, which is exactly what the EULA was saying he couldn't do. So by upholding the EULA, that must mean he's not legally the owner. But did he actually own the software in the everyday sense? It actually sounds like he was stuck owning it. Autodesk basically said to him, this is your software and it's yours forever and there's nothing you can do about it. It sounds like ownership to me. But there's a bigger point here, which is that if they had made the opposite ruling, which incidentally they did for audio CDs, he would legally be the owner. But he'd still be bound by everything else in the EULA. For example, he wouldn't be allowed to make copies of the software. So even though he owned it, it would still be licensed to him. And that's the real point I want to make. Something being licensed to you and owned by you is not mutually exclusive. Many things we buy and own have rules about their use. For example, I own my car, but there's a lot of rules about how I can use that. So the real question is not one of binary ownership, but rather, how restrictive are the rules on the thing you've bought? So how restrictive are EULAs in practice? The Autodesk case was about software saying you can't resell it because the EULA says so. But you can still resell video games in America. When the companies who write these EULAs do try to restrict resale, it's usually through DRM, which suggests that they also don't believe in the strength of the EULA to stop the second-hand market. In Europe, the right to resell has been upheld, even for digital downloads, so it varies by jurisdiction, and the individual video game EULAs, of course, can vary as well. Not all of them will necessarily say that you can't resell the game, for example. So, it's a deep rabbit hole. I could probably make an entire video on this topic, but this isn't that video. Ultimately, the point is that EULAs don't really matter in practice, and even legally speaking, they don't necessarily conflict with ownership. So the next tier down is DRM-free digital. I say DRM-free digital specifically because a lot of people conflate DRM and digital distribution. I used to do the same. You'll see some purists who say they'll only buy physical games because with digital you never really own the game. An example of this is actually in the world of movies rather than games is Christopher Nolan, who gave an interview a while back where he said exactly this, where you have to buy physical to actually own it.
If you buy a 4K UHD, you buy a Blu-ray, it's on your shelf, it's yours. No company, is going to break into your house and take it from you and repossess it. It's yours and you own it. That's never really the case with any form of digital distribution. You're relying on the continued health of the supplier, the company who's supplying it, what have you.
It's nice to see someone famous defending physical ownership, but actually what he said is wrong. It is entirely possible to digitally distribute something in a way where the person who downloads it does get to keep it, and it doesn't rely, as he says, on the health of a service. Just ask the Pirate Bay. They do it illicitly, but they do it. It's of course it's possible. And of course GOG also do this. They give you the offline installer so that you can keep that, and even if GOG disappears, you still have your installer, it still works. So what you're really against here is DRM, not digital distribution, and you have to separate the two. Now when we're talking about DRM-free digital distribution, it's still not as good as physical. You still don't have all your consumer rights. You can't sell a digital game on eBay. You can't lend a digital game to your friend or give it away or anything like that. So you don't have all of your consumer rights intact. Now, in theory, GOG could implement a second-hand market feature, a feature where you can transfer games, transfer licenses to other users, so you can sell your games second-hand. But it wouldn't serve the purpose as a physical second-hand market, because with a physical second-hand market, once the original supply of new games goes away, the game is no longer in print, the existing copies can continue to circulate between all the different users. But if a second-hand market for digital was made, it would be built into GOG, which means that when the supply of new games went away, which would be when GOG eventually shut down or something, the second-hand market would also go away. So it wouldn't be able to serve its primary purpose. So even though a facility like this could be made, it could never serve the same purpose as your actual consumer rights on actual physical goods. And there's a reason why I'm naming GOG in particular for DRM-free distribution, and that's because they have the Galaxy client, which is their Steam-like client. There are other websites, smaller websites, that also do DRM-free distribution, but they're just websites. And for me personally, that's not enough, because they're just websites where you can buy DRM-free games. I already have websites where I can get DRM-free games, and I don't have to pay for them. So I really feel like I need something extra. And Galaxy is that extra because it gives you that Steam-like client to manage your games, and you're just getting a bit more for buying them. There's a B tier here, but there's nothing to go in it. PS5, Switch, and GOG cover all your main options for actually owning your games. There's fairly minor options beyond that. The situation really is that bad, so we're going to jump straight down to the bad section of the tier list, where you don't really own your game. And the first entry there is going to be the ever-popular Steam. Now, there's plenty of digital stores out there. I'm choosing to pick Steam and pick on Steam because it's the one that popularized not owning your games with the release of Half-Life 2 way back when, and it's by far the most popular store. I think what I'm going to say here about ownership is pretty obvious. You don't own your games on Steam. Games on Steam are DRM'd, and Steam itself is really a form of DRM, because even though you can play them offline, you always need Steam itself to install the game. I think the more interesting point to discuss here is why don't you own your games on Steam? And this goes back to the previous discussion about how you actually do own physical games. Why don't you own your Steam games? And I think this really comes down to control. You don't have full control of your games on Steam. For example, you will eventually lose your physical copies of your games. If nothing else, the discs will physically degrade over time and become unplayable. Similarly, you'll eventually lose your games on Steam, for example, if Steam shuts down. So what's the difference? The difference is that the physical game breaking down is an inevitable result of entropy. It can't be avoided. Whereas losing your games on Steam is because somebody has gone in and specifically added code to the game to make it require Steam, even if it actually doesn't require any platform to function. If you've got an offline single-player game, it does not require a server. But if it's on Steam, it's been made to require a server, and so it will eventually break when the server is gone. That is them retaining control. That is them having the ability to remotely disable your game. There may be rules about what you can do with a physical copy, and physical copies may eventually break down, or they could be destroyed or damaged, but you have control. There is no one out there who can snap their fingers and simply decide that your game doesn't work anymore. Why is Steam not in the lowest tier? Because it could be worse. In practice, Steam games can mostly be pirated, with one notable exception that I'll be getting onto shortly. Most Steam games can be pirated. Some Steam games are even DRM free from Steam. You still need Steam to install them, so I suppose they're not strictly DRM free, but the games themselves will work without Steam. Once you get a copy, that copy will continue to work. So you don't own your games in principle on Steam, for the reasons I've discussed, that they're not really under your control. But in practice, between the DRM-free games and piracy being a backup option, the reality is even if Steam goes down, you're not really going to lose all your games because you'll be able to get a copy somehow, somewhere, most likely. So it's not the worst possible situation, it's just not ideal, and it's bad in principle. Now, going back to EULAs for as short a time as possible, where does Steam fit in on the EULA side of things? I think the core point really is that you are not given a copy of the game that is separate from Steam, like you are with, say, GOG. If we look at the notice that Steam has been recently required to display, people focus on the part where it says you're given a license to the game and are very quick to say, well, in every other way of buying the game, you're given a license to the game, which is true. The important part of this notice is actually that it's a license on Steam. If you buy a game on Amazon, you get a physical game that you own along with a EULA stating what your rights are. If you buy a game on GOG, you get a digital game that you own along with a EULA stating what your rights are. If you buy a game on Steam, you get a EULA stating what your rights are. With Amazon and GOG, once you have the game, you never have to interact with Amazon or GOG ever again if you don't want to. They are just the distributor. But with Steam, anytime you want to install it, it's going to be Steam installing it for you. The game and the license are tied to the distributor in this case. So as the notice says, all you really have is a license to use the game on Steam. And that brings us down onto the next tier, which is the ones that are bad in practice and principle. So first of all, you've got the stores on the two consoles, and I'm going to pick on those two consoles in particular because I've said that they're good for physical ownership. Well, if you buy our games digitally, they're the opposite. They're absolutely terrible for ownership. And the other thing I'm going to mention is Denuvo on PC, which essentially does the same thing for PC, because it's the one DRM that's not impossible to crack, but it's so difficult that often these days games with Denuvo aren't cracked. And the consequence of these, between Denuvo making it so that you can't get a pirated copy of your game, and on the digital stores on the consoles, it's a closed platform, so even if you download the game, you have no control over it because you have no control over the platform. You are completely subject to how the publisher or the distributor says you're allowed to use the game. If they decide the game doesn't exist anymore, well, it doesn't exist anymore. Not for you, not for anyone. It's kind of the nightmare situation. There's not really much more to say about it than that. You really don't. If we can discuss the degree to which you own your games with Steam if they're not DRM'd, but if they've got Denuvo on them, you don't own your games. They're there until Steam says they're not there, or Steam shuts down, and then they get Thanos snapped out of existence. The final tier is the final form ultimate nightmare level, which is just streaming services. I've picked Stadia here. In principle, games that are released on the console digital stores or Denuvo protected can be liberated and preserved, but But if something is distributed via a streaming service like Stadia, it never exists locally. You never have the game in any, even the loosest possible sense of the term, owning or possessing the game. You don't. When the streaming service decides the game doesn't exist anymore, it doesn't exist anymore, and that really is it, and there is no, even in principle, way around that. So now we're on to preservation. The top tier of preservation has a whole bunch of things in it. Everything goes in here. There's a lot of different ways that preservation can be helped, but they all have their upsides and downsides. So the first two I'll mention are two that didn't appear so far, which is piracy and emulation. Piracy obviously doesn't do you any good for ownership. You don't own your game if you pirate it. But it's good for preservation, because if a game was DRM'd, for example, if it was released on Steam and then it's cracked, that means the cracked copy can work without Steam, which helps the game function in the future. Emulation, I've just arbitrarily picked the PS2 emulator here. Emulation doesn't really help with your ownership. You don't own your physical console games any more than you did before if you can emulate them. But it does help for preservation in the sense that even if for example, all the PS2s in the world break down, well, you'll still be able to play PS2 games. Physical games that work offline and DRM-free digital are both good for preservation, but have different advantages and disadvantages. This basically breaks down into PC versus console, as consoles don't support DRM-free digital distribution, and PC doesn't really have physical distribution anymore. Physical console games have the advantage that they just work, by which I mean if you have a PS2 game and a PS2, you can play your game. The downside is that the games and consoles will eventually break down. As I mentioned before, emulation can overcome this, but emulating the games and the console comes with all the upsides and downsides of digital games. Digital games can be copied losslessly forever, which makes them easier to preserve than physical copies. That also means, however, that they will outlast their physical counterparts and the hardware that their physical counterparts ran on. This means that actually taking advantage of the longer lifespan of digital copies involves getting them working on newer systems, whether that means getting your old Windows games working on newer Windows, or emulating the entirety of Windows, or emulating a console. So basically with physical games, you're guaranteed to be able to play them for the next few decades without an issue. With digital games, you may be able to play them beyond that, but there is a question mark over it because it depends on support. The good news is that with preservation, you can simply do all of the above. If a game is available on multiple platforms, that's perfectly good for preservation. It doesn't really help you for ownership if a game is available on Steam and on PlayStation, but for preserving the game for the future, it can be available as a physical console game on GOG. There can be pirated copies floating around, and later on you can emulate it. So the more platforms it's released on, the more ways in which the game is preserved. Because these platforms are all up in the S tier together, there's really nothing left for A and B, so we're straight down to the bad section. The first of which, again, is Steam. Steam is bad in principle because the games are tied to Steam. They'll disappear, air quotes disappear, when Steam eventually shuts down in the distant future. But Steam actually provides games for the piracy option in the top tier. So, for example, if a console game is released on Steam, and only Steam on PC, that's actually a good thing for preservation, because in all probability the game will eventually be cracked, and there'll be a DRM-free version floating around, so that in years to come, if all the consoles have stopped working and there's no emulators, well, there's the cracked PC version there. So, in principle, Steam is not good for preservation, but in practice, it's actually beneficial if games get released on Steam as well. Next tier down is again Denuvo and the stores on the consoles. So again, the problem with, say, PS5 and Switch is that they're closed platforms, so if you have games on them digitally and in the future the digital stores go away, what will actually happen is that on the consoles that still have those games, they'll be able to continue playing them, but there'll be no way to acquire a copy, which basically means a finite and ever-decreasing number of copies of the game. A Denuvo game requires Steam in the case that it's distributed by Steam. It also incidentally requires the Denuvo servers, because Denuvo games do check in, which means that any game that's Denuvoed, as before, the benefits of Steam in that you can pirate the games are gone. A Denuvoed game is completely tied to Steam and Denuvo. And when either Steam or Denuvo shut down, those games are gone for everyone, forever. Although again, as I mentioned before, in principle, the games can be liberated even if they're encumbered in this way, which brings us again down to the final tier, which is streaming services, which, once again, are the worst possible option because if a game is only distributed on streaming services and then the game's distribution is terminated, there's not even a local copy to attempt to crack or anything. That game is simply gone forever, and that really is absolutely it. It simply doesn't exist anymore. So that's it for the tier list. My final thought on the matter is, do whatever you want. I've tried to provide an overview of your options for owning games, but what you do with that information is up to you. If you care about games ownership, and if you've watched this far, you probably do, I think you should vote with your wallet. There was a time when I considered giving up on physical distribution because I saw it coming to an end, and I thought, what's the point in continuing to buy consoles and buy physical games if the future consoles are going to be digital only? Then I realized that doesn't make any sense. If this generation of consoles, for example, is the last generation that has physical distribution, if I'm not buying console games this generation, I have no right to complain next generation when it's gone. And even if physical distribution does go away and I'm supporting a dying endeavor, at least I'll still have the games I bought. That's the entire point.